Sarah, I'd love to ask you about the industry itself. You talked about kind of creating some standards in an industry that really has sort of a rogue reputation. Give me some ideas. Why is the farrier business sort of a renegade business in some sense? Unregulated is what I think you said when we spoke last.
Yeah, well, it is just simply that. It's unregulated. Anyone can decide they want to shoe horses or trim their feet and just go do it. There's no rule saying that you have to have an education or a special certification. And there are schools and there are certifications, but you don't have to have one to do it and make money at it and charge money for it. And there's no accountability in terms of the standard. So there's no one that's going to come in behind you and say, oh, you didn't do this according to X standard and therefore you can't practice. So that doesn't exist. The history of farriery, it goes way back. And, we had a time when horses did everything for us, our wars, building our infrastructure with us, our farming, everything. And then it turned into, well, now we have cars and vehicles to do all this. So horses became a hobby. And I guess they've always been commoditized to a certain extent, but when it's mostly in sport or in a legacy sense, an old family that has always had horses, so we just have horses. There's a lot of sports around that in the Western world. We see the rodeo sports that replicate the things that you would see a horse doing on a farm. And in the English disciplines, you see the sports that you would see hunters and jumpers and dressage horses, which are the war moves. That's where we've been. But now we're in a world where people just have horses for hobbies and play. And, who cares about regulating an environment? It's not top of mind. There's just nobody holding it accountable because horses are just hobbies. So I think that's a lot of it. And the other part is that the standard that does exist is largely aesthetic. So when people go to school, they're looking at a form, the hoof, and they're trimming to that. And they're usually getting a pre-made shoe that's made in a factory that's already a designated size. And that foot has to fit that shoe. A lot of times they're too big or too small. So they'll make the foot fit the shoe. And I've learned this just from listening to Seth because he went through a process where he thought the aesthetic doesn't necessarily support the actual function of the hoof. There's internal structures that have to be maintained and supported so that the functionality will be there. But if we're constantly trimming to an aesthetic, oftentimes there's just too much invasive cutting and exfoliation going on that doesn't really take into consideration the environment, the rider weight, the sport, all these other conditions. And so he started thinking about that, like, how do I preserve that? And started thinking more about the form that we see on the outside should be indicative of what's happening on the inside. And that's not something, people will say that you can't look at the outside of a hoof and tell you what it looks like on the inside. That's impossible. You need an x-ray. Everyone agrees with that. But Seth can tell you what the inside of the hoof looks like before he sees the x-ray because he's developed a method where he's measuring everything and he's actually critiquing and evaluating the thickness and the depth and the relationships that the external structures have to each other. And he can look at that and say, I've been taking notes for 15 plus years on the same horses over and over and over again. And there's a consistent pattern there. And if it looks like this, it's either moving away from soundness or toward soundness. And he can see what that x-ray is going to look like. And once he started talking like that, because he was just, sharing with his wife, gee, golly gosh, who am I? Nothing special. And I'm over here, wheels turning, thinking, excuse me, this is huge. This is huge. If we can write this in some form of curriculum, collect the data, and start seeing, charts and graphs that show that this is real, like we're onto something. So that's where I really got ambitious to not let him quit because, 25 plus years doing something and developing what he's developed, that there's no one doing it because you don't have to. Yeah, it was really special to me. And I thought we have to do something with this just because we love horses. They deserve something after everything they put in for humanity.
That's
at least to have healthy feet.
Yeah, that's such a great sentiment. So Seth, do you custom make the actual shoes yourself as well?
A lot of them. I custom made all of them for about 15 years.
Every single shoe.
Wow.
Yeah, now I make I still make quite a few, but not all of them.
So take me through the process, Seth. When you reshoe a horse, explain how that process works.
Well, we get the horse out of its stall and watch it walk so we can see how it's moving and what its current comfort level is. Then we pull the shoes off and test for any soreness in the foot, any of the feet. We take notes, and I trim the feet, the hooves, the toenails, see how they relate to each other. And then we take measurements and build shoes to fit exactly what we need to fit at that time.
Each individual foot.
And by taking notes and measurements for a long time, I started to see how they related to each other when the horses were most comfortable. And so I started moving in my trimming. I started my goal was to get them in that certain relationship where most horses were most comfortable. And it started to work really well. So I started to realize that there needed to be a relationship between all the feet in a certain way.
There was another component too that I guess we discovered it together. He was asked to do a presentation for a group of horse owners and trainers about 10 years ago now. And it was the elite of the dressage community all gathered in one place to ask questions of Seth. And the one thing that he explained, and that they were just understanding, no one had ever asked this of them, but he said, I need to hear, when I walk up to you and ask you, how is your horse moving? A lot of times they would say, fine, but that it wasn't true. There'd be all of these details that they were leaving out or didn't think he needed to know. And when he started to break down all of the things that were really helpful to him, it was like the first time these trainers had understood that if they report that this situation they don't see as related to farriery at all or the feet at all is actually something that he can do something about, they would get better results in their performances and in their competitions. And that was the first time I had ever heard any conversation about that. So that's one of our procedures. Like every guy that works for us, every farrier that works for us has to ask the trainers and the riders, how is this horse moving under saddle? What do you notice? And there's very specific questions that we're learning to ask so we get more than just fine.
That's fascinating because when we spoke last, Seth, you were in your truck and just finishing up a job, and the last part of it was they wanted you to take a look at the horse walking by. And I find that just fascinating that you can look at a horse walking and tell whether its feet are healthy, whether the shoes fit, whether the trim worked. I mean, when you're looking at the walk, what are you looking for?
Kind of the same thing that we would look for in ourselves, just a nice, easy flow, or a slow, easy cadence, smoothness. So anything that gets short or choppy or stiff looking is just an indicator of some discomfort somewhere, or tightness, basically.
Tripping, dragging.
So it's just a lot of looking at thousands and thousands of horses.
And some things are so subtle that I couldn't tell you. Like what the farriers can see, I can't see. I just see a horse walking. And if they say, oh no, he's a little stiff on the left hind, I don't see it. But
Right.
yeah.
So you guys decided to partner and to create a curriculum and to start to document what Seth has developed in terms of this method over the years because it works so well. Sarah, what does this look like? I mean, is this going to turn into a curriculum that you can sell, or you can consult others, or what's the end game for this? Because it sounds like you're onto something that is really reliable and really valuable as well.
Yeah, so we're creating 2 specific curricula. I don't know if that's the right grammar. One specifically for horse owners who really don't intend to shoe their own horses, but maybe they might trim, or they might want to just be able to take a shoe off, that sort of thing. That curriculum is really base knowledge so that when they're speaking with other farriers and veterinarians, and when they're doing whatever work they're doing with their horses, they understand more about the role of hoof care. The second curriculum is specifically made for veterinarians and farriers. And there's 2 goals. One is to train veterinarians and farriers on our methodology so that they can then execute it themselves completely from beginning to end. The other goal is to bridge the culture gap professionally between vets and farriers. Right now, the methods that farriers learn at school and what veterinarians learn at school are not telling the same story. So it's terrible culturally. There's a lot of arguing and just not, it's very difficult for vets and farriers to build healthy relationships with each other. And we feel like if there was one touchstone of academic knowledge that they shared, it would further the relationships in a positive way. And of course, the horses win.